welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about something a little more light-hearted. So it's still ANZAC week, so I'm going to cover the ANZAC sort of stuff, Australia, New Zealand. And yesterday was pretty serious. It was a big hour-long thing on Gallipoli. So today we're going to do something a little bit more fun, and we're going to go to native tank production. So end of 1940, both Australia and New Zealand have sent troops over to the Desert War. I'm specifically not going to cover that in this week because the Desert War is so well covered already, and Australia and New Zealand just sort of fit into the general part of the Desert War, so that's not really going to be covered. Not as much as something like Crete is quite well known, and Australians and New Zealanders sort of fit into Crete, and obviously Al Alamein and all the other missions there, operations and things like that, whereas stuff like Kokoda is not really well known outside of the country, so things like that. Anyway, end of 1940, Australia and New Zealand are both a little bit worried about the Japanese coming down. Turns out that was quite a rational thing to be worried about, and they didn't have tanks. Australians and New Zealanders used tanks overseas, and carriers and Brens and things like that, or universal carriers, Brens. But they couldn't build them at home. They didn't have facilities to build them at home, and they were relying on the British to send them things. But of course, if Australia gets isolated, how are you going to get things sent to you? Remember, this is prior to the US being involved in the war. The US was still supplying people, but they weren't openly operating major well, the US wasn't actually sending troops anywhere to fight, so they couldn't bring their own stuff with them. So Australia was basically no tanks whatsoever. And I'm going to go Australia first and New Zealand second. So first, Australia designed the Sentinel. It's based on a cruiser tank. It looks a lot like a Crusader. People say it's a lower half Sherman, top half Crusader. Sort of, yeah. I mean, I guess it's definitely not an original idea. People have done cast turrets before. People have done cast hulls before. But it was quite a big feat to do from scratch. 3 Cadillac engines all sort of bolted together. 2-pounder gun and a Vickers coax and a Vickers in the hull, in that ridiculous looking hull thing. The reason it's like that is because there's a giant, literally just a Vickers mounted on a tripod thing, just shoved in the front there. It's not on a tripod, but you know what I mean, like a big water-cooled Vickers, so it's got to have that big armoured shell. The British would use normally Beezer machine guns, which are sort of air-cooled things. Anyway, the Sentinel, they built about 60 of them. The reason they stopped building them is because the Americans started supplying the Australians. The British managed to get some tanks through. So the reason they weren't used in combat wasn't because they weren't good enough to be used in combat. It was because they weren't needed to be used in combat. The Americans can just give you infinite Shermans. Basically, they can just give you Shermans. Stuarts, they can just give you Stuarts and Shermans and Scots and all that sort of thing. So why muddle your supply lines up? Why waste time building these when you can build trucks or whatever else? So yeah, basically it wasn't because they weren't good enough. It's because they were just, logistically it didn't make much sense. Australians didn't really make massive use of tanks anyway in the Pacific. So they weren't used, but it wasn't because they weren't good. Now there were three, but we'll say two main versions of the Sentinel. There was the standard tank version, mounted with a 2-pounder gun, and then later on updated to a 6-pounder gun, although the access to 6-pounders was a little iffy. And then the sort of SPG version with a 25-pounder. There's actually a third version that's quite important. The Firefly is quite well known. So the Firefly was a Sherman. It's a British tank. It's a Sherman with a 17-pounder in it. It's quite distinctive. You can tell because of the extended turret. They had to extend the turret out because they had to get a radio set back there. And the Australians actually built a Sentinel with a 17-pounder before the British had built the Firefly. So this is the first tank of its type. This is the first actual tank to be fitted with a 17-pounder. Of course, it was never used in combat, but this tank sort of helped the British to develop the Firefly. And they can tell the similarities here because the way they tested to see if the recoil would work was actually the same. There's a photograph here. They mounted two 25-pounders and then fired them both simultaneously to see if the recoil was acceptable, which it was. People will often say that the recoil of two 25-pounders is similar to the recoil of a 17-pounder. That's wrong. It far exceeds a 17-pounder's recoil. The reason they use two 25-pounders is you don't want to build something that just meets the specs. You don't want to be like, we're like 1% off, completely ripping the mantle out of this thing and sending that gun shooting back through the crew and killing everybody. You don't want to be just near that mark. You want to be quite far away from it. So yeah, the recoil is excessive. You wouldn't want to mount two 25-pounders in a tank like that. It would not be a good idea. I don't think it'd be very useful, especially not firing both at the same time. But yeah, it was used for experimental purposes. Then they had the Thunderbolt. I'm not sure where the name Sentinel comes from. I think it's just sort of a generic name. It looks a lot like a Crusader. Obviously, the turret is very distinctive of a Crusader. It doesn't have the same air intake filters, and it doesn't have all the other types of Crusader-ish type things, but yeah, you get the gist. The suspension looks French, although it's actually American. It's American-style suspension with a French-style assembly. Again, yep, two Vickers 303 machine guns. That's what Australians had. And a crew of 5. Machine gunner / radio operator, loader, gunner, commander, and a driver. So 3 men in that little turret. The turret's a little cramped. It's got the classic Crusader bulge, so you could move your arms around. It would have been a real pain to fight in. The Crusaders were not the best tanks to fight in, especially Crusader 3s with the 6-pounders when you had to get rid of a crewman. Anyway. Did they get rid of it? Yeah, I think they got rid of a crewman. Then they came out with, of course, the Thunderbolt. Thunderbolt was never actually produced. By the time Thunderbolt went into production, the tanks had been supplied, so there was no reason to continue. Thunderbolt is, I'm not sure if it's actually named because of this, but there's quite a famous bushranger called Captain Thunderbolt. He was the gentleman bushranger type guy. So it may be the only tank in the world named after a bushranger. It'd be like calling something it'd be like calling a tank Billy the Kid or Jesse James or something like that. So it's Captain Thunderbolt was a very famous bushranger. So yeah, the Thunderbolt never went into production. It was basically just an improved Sentinel. Basically, up armored, slightly better construction. The engines were tweaked a little bit. The suspension was worked out nicer. It's quite a different tank. 8 feet tall, so not a towering monstrosity like a Sherman, but at the same time, not as good as a Sherman. But yeah, it's quite a nice little vehicle there. I like the Sentinel, and I think it would have done quite well in combat, especially being for what it was. Australia had no large-scale production like this at all. The turret and the hull are both cast because we couldn't weld. Like, we just didn't know how to weld. Or we couldn't do it to the degree you needed to be able to do it. The classic British method was just to rivet. They couldn't weld, they would just rivet. Australia decided to go with the casting because it was just going to be faster and easier. There's also another one called the Australian Light Tank Experimental, the Strand Experimental Light Tank. It's a Vickers light tank basically that's just made over here. It looks pretty much exactly the same as a Vickers light tank. Functions pretty much very similar. It was never put into production because, yeah. So yeah, that's basically it. That's basically the Australian, and the Australian part of it was basically the Sentinel. The Vickers tank was sort of, I'm going to call it the Vickers tank because that's basically what it is. Yeah, it was just a knockoff that wasn't licensed. That's basically what we sort of had was the Sentinel, and there were Australian / sort of defence force type things, sort of British would call them territorial forces, we would have called them militia, reserve units in Australia for home defence. A lot of guys up in the territory mounted on horseback, so there was sort of it was going to be a very mobile defence if an invasion had actually taken place. So these tanks probably would have been quite effective. Now, those tanks would have been quite effective, but these next tanks, well, I think calling them tanks is an insult to an entire genre of vehicle. Let's start with the least embarrassing of the two, the Schofield tank. This is a New Zealand tank. I don't think this is actually a tank. It's a Chevy. It's a Chevy with stuff bolted on it, just plates bolted on it, on wheels, and the suspension there is actually the suspension from a Bren carrier, a modified Bren carrier. So it's a Bren carrier carrying the weight of a Chevy. Originally it had a machine gun in the turret. They replaced that with a 2-pounder because they needed something better. And then they actually sent this over to the UK, or they sent the designs over. Oh no, they sent the vehicle over to the UK for the tank board to have a look at it. And they basically, in the politest way possible, said, please don't waste your time building this piece of garbage. And they scrapped it after the war. So unfortunately, this masterpiece of New Zealand technology doesn't exist. So while Australians were out building basically just cruiser tanks, the New Zealanders wasted their time with an armoured car on tracks that was worse than any armoured car that had ever existed. But that wasn't the worst thing they did. New Zealand, there was a politician in New Zealand who decided that New Zealand needed a morale boost. And this is key here, it was a morale boosting thing. The next thing I'm about to show you was meant to make you inspired that your country was going to be safe if the enemy came to you. If the enemy came and landed troops on the shores, like well obviously D-Day didn't happen, but a D-Day style invasion on New Zealand, these were going to roll out and drive them back in the ocean and save your whole country. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bob Semple. A bulldozer with literal corrugated iron, like the roof of the shed that I'm in right now, and Bren guns. That's what this is. This is corrugated iron and Bren guns. It is 12 feet tall, so it's 50% taller than a Sentinel. It is incredibly top heavy. It's got a crew of 8 people in this thing. One of the gunners is actually lying on a mattress that's put over the engine deck. If you see it driving, it's sort of like one of those World War tanks when they go around, that the crew would be concussed when they go up a big hill and fall down, except it does that over like little bumps in the road. Basically no suspension because it's Caterpillar tractor type thing. The Chinese had versions of these. The most common one that I can think of is the Sutton armored tractor. They didn't convince themselves that these things were tanks, though. They used them as APCs and as AFVs, armored personnel carriers, armored fighting vehicles. The Sutton armored tractor was actually used as a mortar carrier / mortar half-track type mortar vehicle, 2 BARs, and an open cockpit at the back where you could get 2 mortars, take them out, launch mortars, put them back in, drive off. Quite a good design, actually. I like the Sutton quite a lot. New Zealand instead decided to just bolt a crap load of probably tin that they found on someone's shed. This cost £5,000, by the way, to make one of these pieces of garbage. For comparison, a Cromwell, so a cavalry tank of the British, made about the same time, 1942, cost £10,000. So obviously you have to talk about refitting and retooling. These things were made in a couple of hours. They cost £5,000 each. What a monumental waste of money. They made 2 of them. When they paraded them, they did a big parade in New Zealand to inspire people that this piece of literal garbage, like as in refuse crap with Bren guns on it, would save them from the Japanese. They actually gave very clear instructions to the driver. If you change gears, the entire tank stops. So if you're going as fast as this thing can, which is not very fast at all, and you change gears, it will just stop and then change gears. So unless you're going downhill. If you're going downhill, it's fine, because the momentum will actually drive your tank downhill, but you can't hit the brakes at all. So you have to actually put it in reverse and go back up, which is not a good idea. So yes, don't change the gears if you're going on any sort of flat ground, and if you're going on any sort of sloped ground, don't even think about stopping until you get to the bottom. It is 12 feet tall, which is very, very tall for a tank. The Sherman often gets sort of criticized for being quite tall. At least the Sherman had armor and was tall. 8 Bren gun. There's 2 Bren guns in the front, one in a turret, side, back, sort of like an A7V setup. Only, the A7V had more armor. It didn't have much armor at all. It's sort of like that, but crap and garbage. So this was New Zealand's go at tanks. The Bob Semple and the Schofield, compared to Australia's Sentinel / Proto Firefly, which was actually basically used by the British in a Sherman chassis. The reason the sort of 17-pounder version of the Sentinel wasn't adopted was because by the time that they were bringing them out, they had access to American stuff. They were going up against the Japanese with the Hagos and the Chihais. I think that's what they are. The sort of medium, like the Japanese called light tanks medium tanks, basically, for their purposes. Anyway, a lot of the Pacific will be done with things like Stuarts and Grants and Lees and that sort of stuff anyway. So that's the video for today. I thought I'd do a little bit more lighthearted one today. I was going to talk about the Boer War, but the Boer War needs its own. That's going to be a long, like Gallipoli length episode. Not this week. That'll be sometime in the future because there's just so much to go through there. There's so much stuff of. There was a very close relationship between Rhodesia and South Africa in the 1960s and 70s, and then people have extrapolated it back into the past where they think that these two countries were always friends when in fact they were actually quite big enemies because they were both fighting over the same resources. The whole camps versus commandos and how do you treat guerrilla forces, and were the guerrillas using, if you make all these rules up and the enemy doesn't follow them, do you have to follow your own rules, that sort of thing. So the Boer War is going to be a big unpacking thing all of its own. So stay tuned for the rest of ANZAC week, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful day.